Okay, so we're in a series of talks at the moment, which is about transforming self and world. And I suppose the key theme of this series of talks is that actually you don't do one without the other. So if we transform ourselves, we transform the world. If we transform the world, we'll transform ourselves. They're interconnected. And that's for good or for bad, actually. So if we transform ourselves for the better, the world will become a better place. But if we kind of transform ourselves for the worse, the world will become a worse place. Okay. And last week, Bodhi Naga told the story of the Naga in the fire chamber. And he talked about how we transform emotions that we find difficult by facing up to them. The story really is about how if you face up to a dragon, a demon, you can tame it. The Buddha tamed a dragon. So what we can do is if we're having difficult emotions that we don't like, if we turn towards them and face them and pay them attention, we can tame them. They'll become smaller. There's a lovely image that Bodhi Naga talked about of the Buddha holds a little dragon in a begging bowl. It's an image that I took away with me, actually. I thought it's just such a lovely image. And it's a bit like that's what we can do with difficult emotions. We can tame them and we can hold them in our begging bowl and they can be on our side. So that's one approach. What I'm going to talk about tonight is very much from the story of the Buddha. The Buddha obviously transformed himself tremendously and then had a tremendous effect on the world as well. So I'm looking at the example of the Buddha transforming himself, transforming world. And it's a really good time, very timely talk, this one, because yesterday was Buddha Day. So the full moon in May every year is celebrated throughout the world as the day when the Buddha became enlightened. That was yesterday, and we'll be celebrating it, as Bodhi Naga said, on Sunday. And so some of the stories that I'm going to tell today, you'll hear again on Sunday if you come. Hear them in a kind of much more in-depth way, be able to engage them in a puja. Okay, so the thing about the Buddha is not only did he wake up to reality, but he managed to find a way to communicate it to other people, which I think is really important. I think a lot of people probably have woken up in some way to reality, but they haven't managed to communicate it in the way that he did. And I'm going to tell now quite a bit of the Buddha's story. Now, for some of you, that might be the first time you're hearing some of these stories. For some of you, you will have heard them many times before. So if you want to, you could have like a little sleep. It's fine. Or you could maybe just try and think about, well, how do you resonate with these stories as mythic stories, as archetypal stories? Can you relate to them? Can you see how they relate to your life and your life as transforming as a practitioner? Okay, so the Buddha was born 2,500 years ago in northern India, what's now actually Nepal, and he was born into privilege and luxury. He was the very loved son of someone like a chieftain, someone who had quite a lot of money and power in his community. And the story goes that he was very much protected by his father from suffering. His father didn't want him to leave, he wanted him to stay, and so what he thought he'd do is if he gave him this like perfect life, the Buddha-to-be would never want to leave. So the Buddha kind of grew up in a pleasure palace or pleasure palaces, surrounded by everything that he might want. And I think he grew up to be kind of a very handsome bloke with very skilled, kind of very popular, lots of things going for him. But after a while, he started to wonder about what was going on outside those city walls or outside his palace. That's how the story goes. And he managed to sneak out of the palace a few times. And when he sneaked out, he visited some villages, some towns nearby where people were living. And he saw some examples, I suppose, of the reality of being a human being. So the story goes that for the first time he saw an old person. So he saw someone bent over with age, struggling along, not able to walk very well. He also saw someone who was ill. So somebody who was in pain, looking, very poorly. They'd never seen that before. And then he saw a dead body. And the story goes he'd never seen that before either. And then the fourth thing that he saw, these are called the four sights. The fourth sight that he saw was a wandering sort of wise man, a beggar perhaps, somebody who didn't have have many possessions at all, who was quite poor, but yet there was something about them. They seemed to have a kind of a happiness, a contentment that the other people he met didn't have. And he was really intrigued by this wandering beggar. He kind of got a sense of something else. Okay, so you've got this idea of this person, so it's a mythic story. I don't know if really anyone could be kept, in a palace and not seeing the realities of life. But actually it might be a myth that we might, as Westerners, somewhat resonate with. Because I think some suffering is kind of kept from us. We put old people in homes, we don't see dead bodies. If people are ill, we put them in hospital. It's like you can, in a way, get through your life without actually really coming across the realities of those types of suffering. Okay, so the Buddha was very profoundly shocked by seeing them. I think that's how the story goes, very profoundly shocked by seeing old age, sickness and death, and intrigued by this wandering beggar. And because of this, he decided he wanted to leave his home, leave his lovely palace, leave his pleasure palace, and go out and seek another way of living. And what he did was, he left home, he sneaked out of his palace, and he went to look for a teacher who could help him. First of all, he went to the best teachers of the day, and he learned all the meditation practices they could teach him. And he was actually like the best at those practices, so much so that after a while the teacher said, well, look, would you like to kind of take over? It's like, you've obviously really mastered this, you're really good at this, you could take over. But he thought, no, there's something more going on that I'm not quite getting here. So at that time, it was very fashionable to do ascetic practices, which are basically practices where you kind of mortify the body, I suppose in the help that kind of releases your spirit in some way. So there'll be things like, for instance, a person might decide to stand on one leg for years. Literally for years. I think they might still do that in India, I'm not sure. Or there was a thing called the 5 suns, where in the heat of the Indian summer, you'd sit under the sun, but you'd light 4 fires around you. So you were absolutely baking hot and you'd suffer there. Or another thing you'd do is you'd just stop eating. You'd eat maybe just like a grain or 2 of rice every day, so you'd starve yourself. And again, the Buddha was really, really good at these practices. So he starved himself to almost like a skeleton. And he got some followers who thought he was really great. And he had like a little community that he was the teacher of. But he realised he actually wasn't getting anywhere with this kind of ascetic practice, with this mortifying practice. So he wondered what to do next. And I wonder if it's because he was like in a state where actually he didn't have a very clear mind. Because if you're starving, you don't have a very clear mind, It's like he wasn't getting to that place he wanted to get to, where he could understand where suffering came from and what could be done about it. But what he did remember was something that happened to him when he was a young child, I suppose about 9 years old. He remembered sitting under a tree. It's a rose apple tree in the story. I don't know what a rose apple tree is, but it sounds really lovely. He sat under a rose apple tree. And his father, the chieftain, was performing some kind of annual ritual practice of like ploughing the earth. And as the Buddha-to-be sat there, a kind of state of peace, of calm, but of alertness came over him. He entered into what we call the first dhyana. So it's a state you can enter in meditation, but it's also a state that will come to us perhaps if we're listening to music, if we're being creative, if we're working at something we enjoy. It's a kind of state of flow in which your mind is very alert, very relaxed, and very supple. And it's a state of mind in which we aren't having our thoughts think us. Actually, we can direct where we think. So it's a very powerful state to be in. And the Buddha remembered being in that state under the rose apple tree, and he thought, I wonder if there's something in that. I wonder if that's what I should try. So he decided to give up his ascetic practice, and he even accepted some lovely rice pudding from a young woman who was passing and gave him some rice pudding. And all his followers were really disappointed in that. They were profoundly underimpressed that he'd decided to eat something, and they kind of called him all sorts of names and left him. So he was kind of on his own, but he'd had some food. I suppose the myth here is he'd had some food, he'd had some nourishment, and he then went and found a lovely Bodhi tree in the place which is now Bodh Gaya, and decided to sit down, and he was going to stay there until he saw reality, until he was enlightened. He was just going to stay there. He made like a really strong vow to do that. So I can imagine he kind of sat there and he thought, great, here I am at last in my wonderful place, and I've had my rice pudding and everything's looking really good. And I remember that I want to kind of get into that state of mind like when I was a child, so I'm just going to rest my awareness on my breath and go into that state. But as you might have experienced, if you've ever sat down and thought, this is what I'm going to do, he suddenly was actually assailed by all sorts of thoughts of anger, anxiety, craving, lust that assailed him. And there's some wonderful stories around that you'll hear on Sunday. The stories are called of Mara's sons and Mara's daughters. And Mara is a kind of embodiment of everything that gets in the way of us becoming enlightened, becoming aware, becoming kinder, becoming more open to our experience. Mara is a kind of figure, a bit like the devil, but kind of not exactly, who kind of, will get in the way of what we want to do. And so the way the story goes is that Mara realizes that the Buddha is very nearly going to break through and leave Mara's realm forever. And so he does all that he can to try and get Mara to get the Buddha to give up, I suppose. And I think these stories are very interesting, actually, because they're a kind of really good example of how myths and stories work, archetypal stories work. Because if you'd happened to have been there at the time, you'd have just seen this guy, this very thin guy, sitting under a tree all night, and then sitting still, and then he kind of gets up in the morning and wanders about a bit. And so if you'd been, like if you had some kind of like CCTV camera on the Bodhi tree, that's what the really bored operator of the CCTV camera would have seen, would have just been this kind of guy sitting there. Whereas I think these stories give us a feeling of what actually his experience was like. So the stories are that, first of all, Mara sends in his army, and his army is of his sons. And they are the horriblest, fiercest monsters that you can imagine, okay? With fangs and ugly heads and just whatever your really nasty monsters are. And they kind of all attack the Buddha, and they make horrible screaming, screeching noises at him to frighten him. And they start to fire arrows and spears at him. But it's a bit like there's a force field around the Buddha sitting under the tree, and as the arrows or the spears hit the force field, they turn into flowers, and they just fall around the Buddha. So the Buddha's actually surrounded by petals and flowers. And even though these demons and these monsters just do their best, they can't affect the Buddha at all. So they all slink off in despair. Then Mara sends in his second kind of deadly weapon, which is his daughters, who are beautiful, beautiful daughters. And of course the Buddha is like a man in his 30s, sitting under the tree, and the daughters come in and do all their best to seduce him with, come on Saturday and hear the stories. I'm not even going to try and say what happens, but they use their wiles to try and seduce him, but he's not moved at all. He's not moved by that at all. And so they give up, and off they go as well. And then Mara tries his last desperate attempt. And actually, this is something which often does get to us. What he does is he uses doubt. So he tries to make the Buddha doubt his right to be there, trying to get enlightened. So he goes up to the Buddha and he says, so you're sitting here, what right do you have to sit on this throne of enlightenment thinking that you can do this? You're just a kind of some guy from northern India somewhere. What do you think you're doing? And what the Buddha does is he touches the earth. So just in that same mudra, this same way of having your hands that this Buddha has here, he touches the earth. And what he's doing when he touches the earth is he's calling the earth goddess to witness him. So she comes up from the earth and she says, I have seen the Buddha practicing for hundreds of lifetimes. I've seen him being ethical, being kind, being generous, time after time after time. He has purified his mind and his heart, and he has every right to sit on this place. And that's the final thing that the Mara can't take, and off he slinks away, leaving the Buddha. But the interesting thing, actually, I think, is that in terms of how we might think about Mara, is that even after the Buddha is enlightened, Mara keeps coming back to call on him. And I think that's useful to remember, that it's not like once the Buddha's enlightened, he never has these forces of kind of doubt, of anger, anxiety, craving. They do come, but he just says, Mara, I see you. I see you for what you are. And then Mara has to kind of go away again and wait for another time to come back. Anyway, so going back to the story, so there's the Buddha, he's sitting under the tree, he's seen off the forces of doubt, of craving, of anxiety, fear, anger. And he then starts to go into a kind of a state of mind or a state of being in which all sorts of understandings or insights into how reality is arise in him. So he starts to see that he's part of a process of conditions, just arising and going away. And he sees how we're all part of that process, we're all interconnected. Basically, there's a whole load of conditions that have come together that allow us to be here. And when those conditions change, we change. In time, we pass away, new people come along. It's just like this whole flow of lives going on. And he saw how actually we can work with that particular flow of processes, that we can work with this kind of natural law in order to create the kind of person we'd like to be. So he sees this all through the watches of the night. And then, just as dawn is coming, as the morning star arises on that full moon day in May, he becomes enlightened. He breaks through and he wakes up. So that's the story of how the Buddha is enlightened. And okay, just a second, because I've said loads of pages here. Okay, so he's become enlightened, but to us that, sometimes you can think, what does that mean to be enlightened? So I've kind of got like an image. Okay, so just sort of bear with this. So kind of imagine, okay, that you've kind of like been kidnapped by like a really evil genius or like an evil wizard. And you can choose, like you could have an evil genius, that kind that's got like a white cap that goes like that. Or you could have like an evil wizard who's got kind of like a hat or something and kind of does magic on you. You can choose. But anyway, they've kidnapped you and they've left you in this kind of unknown landscape all by yourself, okay? So you're there. And actually, the interesting thing is that really, you are part of that landscape, okay? You're an integrated, interconnected part of the landscape, because your bones are made of the same stuff that makes up the kind of white crags that you see beside you. The water that's inside you is the same as the water in the beautiful river that's running by you. You're breathing in oxygen and you're breathing out carbon dioxide, and the plants around you are kind of absorbing that carbon dioxide. So it's like you're completely part of this natural system that's going on in this world. You're part of this world. However, what the evil genius has done to you, in a very mean way, is they fitted you up with these kind of weird big goggles and these big headphones on, okay? And you're being sent false information through the goggles and through the headphones all the time. And this false information is basically saying to you, you've got to look out for yourself, okay? You've got to look out for yourself. You've got to make sure you get what you want, okay? Even if you have to trample on everyone else, you've got to do that because you're the most important thing. And it's a bit like these goggles are kind of giving you a picture of a world in which you're the centre of the world. And the bizarre thing is, actually, you do see all these other beings wandering around alone, stumbling about with their goggles and their headphones on. But you still think you're the most important one in the world, even though you can see there are others who are doing it too. And in some ways, what's happening, it's a bit like the evil genius is sending you these messages that say that, will tell you some things that just aren't true, actually, and lead you into behaving in ways that are really unhelpful and make you unhappy. So it's a bit like the evil genius is telling you that if you drink salted water, you're really thirsty, so you want to have a drink, so you go and drink some salted water, and actually it just makes you more thirsty, okay? And you keep drinking it, and it's just going to make you more thirsty. It's never going to make you, not thirsty anymore. And examples of those kind of things would be, for instance, if you've ever been a smoker. So basically, every time you have a cigarette, you're just sending that particular addiction back into your bloodstream. Or if you love sugar and cakes, and you just keep, every time you have some sugar, you're just saying up another thing where you're going to want a bit more sugar. Or you've ever been in love with someone who really isn't bothered about you at all, but you just keep going back there for a bit more torture. Or, or you are in a relationship and you think that your partner might give you the thing that will make you whole, that will make this unhappiness, and you just go away forever. And actually it's their job to do that, and they should just get on with doing it. Anyway, there are all sorts of things that will, that actually are, these evil geniuses telling us will make us happy. And they won't. Okay, and I think it's important actually that we do have these distortions of reality in a way. It's basically, we do have a whole part of ourselves that is working from greed, that's working from hatred or anger. And they've been very important to us in our evolutionary past, okay? If we hadn't been quite good at eating loads of stuff and killing it and eating it, or we hadn't been quite good at hitting things that got in our way or running quite fast from them, our genetic structure or whatever wouldn't be here today. So there's something about those ways of looking at the world that actually has served us very well in the past, but it doesn't serve us so well now, okay? And I suppose what the Buddha taught us was other ways of looking at the world, that we realise that we are beings that have greed, that have hatred, that are ignorant, deluded about the way that the world works, but that we can actually apply a kind of a way of looking at things. That means that we can do more than that. We don't have to just react all the time. We can be quite creative in the way that we are in the world. And and I suppose what I'm saying, yes, so it's a bit like these distortions of reality, as I said, these hallucinations almost of the way that the world is. Because I kind of imagine all these creatures, us, with our headphones on and our goggles on, and we're kind of stumbling about. And actually we're stumbling about all the time over boulders that don't even exist. We've created them, It's like we're seeing a hallucination of how the world is, and it doesn't have to be like that. And not only do they come from our evolutionary history, but they also come from the custom and society that we're brought up in, just kind of the way that we're told things are. Look out for number one, whatever it is we've been told. And they will come from our own particular conditioning, our own families. We'll have particular ways of looking at the world, that our goggles, the glasses, the lenses in our goggles, that have been created by our own particular conditioning as well. So, I suppose what the Buddha did is he realised that he was wearing goggles and had headphones on, which is kind of weird, just thinking as they weren't invented at that time. But he did. So he realised, this metaphor of the goggles and the headphones, and he was able, I suppose, to take them off or to see through them. I mean, I don't know if you can ever necessarily completely take them off, but perhaps you can start to see through the messages that you're being sent by the evil genius and kind of question them and ask if they're true or not. And I think what was great about the Buddha, as I said earlier, is he was able to communicate that to us. And actually he was also able to communicate something of the way that the landscape is. That he lives in, the landscape, that if we weren't wearing those goggles, that we didn't have the headphones on, what we would be seeing and hearing, what kind of world we'd be living in. He communicated some of the beauty of that. So, however, only we can start to clean our own glasses, our own goggles, and start to see through or hear the voices that we're hearing and question whether they're true or not. No one else can do that for us. The Buddha's taught us a way, but we have to do it ourselves. Buddhism, I see it as like a practice of just taking more and more responsibility in a way for your own life and the way that you are in the world. Okay, so what I want to do now is to just go back and look at some of the stories of the Buddha, the myth of the Buddha and his enlightenment, in terms of what we can learn from that and how it kind of works with this idea of us like taking off the goggles and the headphones and all that. Okay, so the first thing is, of course, he has to, the first thing the Buddha had to do is he had to get himself out of that pleasure palace and he had to see the reality of what was going on. He had to see old age, sickness and death. So he had to see that there was suffering in the world and that things were impermanent. And he had to know that in some kind of a way. But it's not just enough to know that, because I think for many of us, when we know that, it can just lead to nihilism. It can just lead to a way of thinking which is, Okay, there's loads of suffering in the world, you suffer loads, then you die. What's the point in anything? You might as well just try and get as much hedonistic pleasure as you can while you're alive. Or you might as well just be really, really depressed while you're alive. It's just like, it's a very kind of meaningless way to be. So there's somehow the Buddha had to understand that there's suffering, that we are all going to die and everyone we love is going to die, but be able to still have a sense of meaning in the world. And for me, I think that's what the fourth sight represented. It was somebody somehow who could live in a world of impermanence and yet be contented in some way and be happy and be able to give to others. But that's only the way that I see it. I imagine that for you, the fourth sight, perhaps this wandering beggar, might mean something else. I think meaning is particularly important to me. To other people, it might mean something else. And I think that's a really important thing about these myths of the Buddha, is that they will have lots of different meanings to different people at different times. So you might want to think, what does it mean to you to see the fourth sight? Have you ever seen the fourth sight? What gives you a sense that there's something different in the world, a different way that you could be? Okay. Then the second thing he needed to do, it seemed, was he had to leave his household. He had to leave behind this palace in which he was living in order for him to grow and develop. Now, for some of us, that might not be possible, actually, literally. For some of us it is, actually. And I think sometimes we underplay the importance that we can actually go forth and, literally no longer live in conventional ways, live in other ways, perhaps live in a community or something like that. But perhaps for some of us that isn't possible. But what we might think about is, well, what does going forth in that sense of leaving the household life, what does that mean for us? How might we be in a household with a family, but doing that in a way where we're not kind of having our whole identity being dependent on being a mother or a father, a wife or a husband, whatever it is that we see as our identities. How perhaps we can live within a household but just be much looser to it and go forth from some of the things that might get in our ways. Again, that's something to think about. What does that mean to you, this idea of going forth? And I suppose you might say that our society, those voices coming down the headphones would say to us actually, the way to be happy is that you get yourself a really nice partner and then you have a really nice family and you live in a lovely house and then you'll be happy. And I suppose if we believe that those things will lead to ultimate happiness, then we're in trouble. I'm not saying that those things won't give us pleasure and support us and are good for us. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm just saying we have to have a different relationship, I think, or else we will ultimately suffer. Okay, so the next thing I suppose is the Buddha went off and after various things that he then took up this ascetic lifestyle. So that's kind of not fashionable these days. All those kind of, I don't think even in the Catholic Church nuns no longer hit themselves with sticks and all that kind of stuff, as far as I know. But I sometimes wonder about some of the extreme sports that go on. They sound a little bit like fell running, for instance. Always feels to me like it might be a bit of asceticism involved in there. But anyway. But I do think what we maybe do to ourselves in our society is we think that if we torture ourselves mentally, somehow we'll grow. And to me, it feels like, what we do is we know that we've got these headphones and these goggles on, and we kind of hit ourselves with a big stick in order to try to get them off us. And it's just not going to work, actually. It's a bit like if we're saying to ourselves, oh, you're really stupid, you should stop doing that, all that kind of way of being, that torturing of ourselves, thinking that we're stupid or whatever it is, that's only going to lead to more suffering. And we don't need more suffering in the world. I don't think that kind of is a form of asceticism that many of us do. And I suppose what we need to do, if we can, is to develop a sense of kindness around ourselves. And that's the way we'll gradually grow. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I think most people will have the experience that if they talk to themselves in that particular way of really turning themselves off, telling themselves they're stupid or torturing themselves in that way, it actually just leads to you kind of making the same mistakes again and again. It doesn't seem to be a way that we grow, even though we keep doing it. So I think we need to look at different ways that we can, the Buddha found that asceticism of the body didn't work for him, and I don't think asceticism of the mind and the soul, if there's such a thing, asceticism of the mind and the spirit works for us either. So, okay, and I think the next thing that the Buddha did, which is he had some rice pudding, and then he And then he remembered, his experience of pleasure under the rose apple tree, because first dhyana is just very pleasurable. And so what he realised is actually through pleasure that we will get ourselves into a mental state where we will be able to examine our experience. And I don't mean pleasure of the kind of just pleasure of the senses. What I mean is that, if we're well, we're looking after ourselves, we're healthy, and we are being contented and meditating, mental states can arise in which we are able to examine our own experience and to reflect on it. It's a bit like, in order to see through these hallucinations that we're getting through the goggles and everything, we need to actually be in a really positive state of mind, because we need to have them there, but we also need to see through them. Okay, so then he's sitting under the tree, and of course he is attacked by Mara's army, Mara's daughters, and Mara himself, and doubt. So I suppose in a way that's really when it happens in meditation, and after meditation, when we're able to just to be with our experience as much as we can and turn towards our experience. And I think that's where the mindfulness of breathing and mindfulness in life is really, really important. Because it allows us to, the more mindful we are, the more we can understand what's really going on. And the more we can say to ourselves, if we're telling ourselves stories, that they're just stories. But you need to be mindful not to be caught up in them. And I think mindfulness, has various different aspects. There's mindfulness of what's going on for us at the moment. There's also mindfulness of what will be the consequences of our actions. And there's mindfulness of other people as well. So those are, we need to be really keeping a kind of broad level of mindfulness. But I think in a way, the practice of mindfulness of breathing, it's basically what we do is, we sit, we breathe, we're trying to put our awareness on our breathing, and our mind wanders off, then we bring it back. Then our mind wanders off, then we bring it back, and we just keep doing that. And that's just the best training in order to be able to be with your experience, whatever your experience is, to be able to move into that. And that allows you to be like the Buddha and turn irritation, anxiety into flowers, not to be kind of moved by whoever or whatever's trying to seduce you, and to have some kind of, real belief in yourself that you can practice. So again, that might be something to think about. How do you work in the mindfulness of breathing? Are you developing an ability to have more equanimity, to not be swayed so much by the activities of your mind? And I think it takes a lot of courage, it takes a lot of patience, and it takes a lot of perseverance to keep sitting with the difficult things that our minds can throw at us, that Mara can throw at us. Okay, and I suppose it's about we need to see our thoughts are just phantoms. We don't need to take them seriously, but we need to realise they're part of being human. They're just part of being human. We don't need to identify with them, but we don't need to think we're rubbish or bad for having them. That's just how we are as beings. It's sort of hardwired into being a human. If we're a human being, we're hardwired with all sorts of ways of looking at the world that aren't helpful, but what we need to do is be able to work with those in a way that we can bring them on side with us. Okay, so what I've talked about is some ways that you might think about some of the stories around the Buddha and his own enlightenment, how he transformed himself and how we might transform ourselves. I'm also very briefly actually just going to talk a little bit about a story of him, how the Buddha perhaps set out transforming the world. And, okay. Well, do you know, actually, I'm not going to. Okay? Because I don't really think I've got enough time. I feel like I've talked for long enough. And I'm just going to say that actually what the Buddha did do, which was interesting, is that once he'd become enlightened, he just set out and he just walked around India. So he didn't set up a big crusade. He didn't kind of go, wow, I've really got the answer, and I want you all to get behind me, and I'm going to kill you if you don't agree with me. And he didn't set up some kind of a big campaign and try and get those people to sign up or kind of whatever. He just wandered around, and when he bumped into people, he talked to them. And then they picked up something from him, they changed themselves, and then they wandered around and they talked to some other people and they picked up on that. And through just that simple way of going from person to person and people changing and then another person changing, well, the Buddha set up something that has lasted for 2,500 years and that has positively affected hundreds of millions of people, I imagine, through history. I mean, it occurred to me, I don't really know enough about history of Buddhist countries, but it'd be interesting, you could almost look and see that there must have been hundreds of years in some countries, I hope, where they weren't having big wars and there were all sorts of things weren't going on because people were practicing as Buddhists in those countries. Perhaps be an interesting thing to look at. And I think that even though the Buddha himself, he didn't do any of those things that we kind of think you might do to try and get people to do stuff. He just was able to go and talk to them and listen to them and allow them to grow and change. And then he created something which has changed millions of lives. Okay, so I just want to finish with just one thing, which is, two things. So it's about some events that I'm looking forward to, okay, and I just want to make sure you know about them as well. So the first is that the next couple of weeks on Sangha Nights, on Tuesday nights, we're going to have some really great talks, I think. Particularly, and they are in the theme of transforming self and world. Next week, someone called Vardika, who is originally from Sheffield, around here somewhere, yeah, but now lives in somewhere else, Estonia. Estonia, yes. Anyway, he has been doing a lot of thinking around Buddhism and the kind of current economic system we live in. And last year at the International Sangha Retreat, he gave a talk where there was a standing ovation. I have never been at a Sangha talk where there's been a standing ovation before. It was quite remarkable. I'm not expecting that we'll do that next week, but he's coming to talk next week. So I'd really invite you to come because I imagine that he'll have something very interesting to say. And then the week after that, we've got Vajratara who's coming to speak to us. And some of you will know Vajratara because she was very instrumental in the earlier days of the centre. She has given a lot of talks on Sangha Night. She's one of the women at the retreat centre where women go to train for ordination. She's quite a remarkable woman. And she's going to talk about Dr. Ambedkar, who's a figure that Vidanya talked about that first night of this series. And Dr. Ambedkar he was from India, and he was from what's known as the untouchable caste. And what he managed to do is through education, basically, he kind of was able to educate himself and become a very powerful figure in India. Like he was head of the committee that wrote the constitution of India when it went independent. But what he decided to do was to convert to Buddhism, and hundreds and millions of other people, well, millions of other people anyway, converted with him. And in their lives, you can really see how we can change ourselves and we can change society, or how we can change the world and how we can be changed. I think there's something very strong about that. And Vajratara will be talking about that. But actually, this coming Saturday and Sunday, you've got a chance to meet two amazing women from India who are from that background and who themselves are putting that into practice in their lives. And I just particularly like to invite you, if you'd like to meet them, to come at 10:30 next Sunday morning, before Buddha Day, and they'll just be talking about their lives and what it means to them, I suppose, to transform self and transform world. Okay, thank you.